Power armor is very important to Warhammer 40,000, appearing in the hands of several different factions within the setting, but most notably the Space Marines. But the Horus Heresy is quite different from 40k, and this especially applies to the power armor used. The power armor of the modern 40k setting had to come from somewhere, and the armor of the Horus Heresy really set a tone both in-universe and outside of it as to what we think of as Space Marine Power Armor, with each iteration and type of armor building to the modern Primaris Space Marines that we have now. Before the iconic Mark II suit, there's one armor that I want to briefly discuss, and that is the Mark I Thunder Armor. Used by the Thunder Warriors and the Space Marine Legions deployed during the Unification Wars, this suit, while protective, is primitive in comparison to what would come afterwards. It lacked life support, any rebreather due to the fact that it had, no traditional Space Marine helmet, and motorized legs, meaning that anyone who used it was incredibly slow. This suit was abandoned for field use the second something better came around, with it only being used for ceremonial purposes after this point. The Mark II Crusade pattern was the first real recognizable suit of Space Marine Power Armor, with every suit beyond it being an iteration on the groundwork laid by this armor. Motorized legs, a sealed helmet, and life support were added, and for most of the Great Crusade, this was the armor used by every legion, and is a really strong symbol for the period. The helmet itself is very similar to the Great Helm that medieval knights used, featuring a one-piece visor with various onboard systems allowing for 360-degree situational awareness and battlefield data being streamed to the user, something every power armor suit afterwards would feature. Its armored structure is quite different from later suits, however, as it featured a hooped plate design, as plates would slide in and out of each other to allow for more articulated movement instead of mechanical joints, which were not possible at the time. This suit is awesome. I really like the way certain legions look in it, but my favorite is probably the White Scars, since they look good in any suit of power armor due to their color scheme, and I enjoy the White Scars. The Mark III Iron Armor, while not a replacement for the Mark II, does have some improvements to the design that makes it a better suit for certain situations. All it is basically just an up-armored variant of Mark II, with extra plating on the chest and most of the upper body, and the power cabling being rerouted into different areas to better protect the suit's vital functions. It features a slightly different helmet, as it had two separate eyepieces instead of the one-piece visor used by the Mark II, and the suit itself was primarily designed to be used for close-quarters fighting in areas without cover, along with boarding actions. And this suit would fill that role very heavily before Terminator armor was introduced to fill that gap. Not all legions adopted it in large quantities, but the ones that did included the Death Guard, Iron Warriors, and Imperial Fists, along with the Salamanders, as their styles of warfare was far more conducive to the heavier but clumsier plating. Even legions like the World Eaters and Dark Angels liked it for different reasons, using the thicker plating to help in melee combat. But speaking of Terminator armor, the Cataphractii Terminator armor was the first Terminator, or tactical dreadnought armor, developed and used by the Space Marines. Originally, Terminator armor was designed to replace standard Space Marine armor, but after the Heresy, it was seen that standard Space Marines could outmaneuver these suits, and combined with lost resources, it would be used by elite members of Space Marine chapters in a specialist role. Terminator armor really excelled at tunnel fighting and other uses that the Mark III was designed for, superseding it and making it the go-to for that style of warfare. The Cataphractii is beefy. It's easily the strongest and most protective variant of Terminator armor to this day, and is just really cool looking. However, it does have a few drawbacks, mainly its speed. All that armor plating has to adapt for something, and this suit is incredibly slow. Like, slower than Thunder Warrior slow. That being said, this suit was used by every single legion in ample supply, with even the Legio Custodes getting in on the action. But the next real innovation in power armor design would come with the Mark IV Maximus suit. This was a full-on upgrade from the 2 and the 3, as due to new technology and other stuff found during the Great Crusade, this was all put into a power armor design in order to make up for the shortcomings of both the Mark II and the 3, and it did not disappoint. This is an incredibly well-optimized and fantastic general-purpose suit, and was easily the best suit of power armor up until that point. It had ditched the hooped armor structure and went with a more modern, solid plate design with mechanical joints that would be used in every single suit after this. It had an enhanced helmet. It was just a really great suit overall. It would fully replace the Mark II entirely in many legions, with most of them showing up in the hands of the Traitor Legions, as Horus would use his abilities as War Master to choose which legions got which supplies, and as such, in order to better equip the traitors for the oncoming heresy, he decided to give them the advantage. The Tartaros pattern Terminator armor was based on a very similar principle to the Mark IV, incorporating a lot of those advancements into it, making it basically the best Terminator armor even now. Other than the fact that it was slightly weaker than the Cataphracti, this suit is still relevant, and not many variants of it still exist, as most of the traders got those suits, and the only surviving suit of Mark IV that I can think of exists in the hands of the Minotaurs and Gabriel Angelos of the Blood Ravens. Now, up until this point, most of the armor designs have this very knightly Napoleonic war blended with a brutal medieval aesthetic, with the armors either being elegant or brutal. And somehow the Mark V Heresy pattern does both of these and none of them at the same time, mostly out of necessity. The Mark V is not really an armor mark, more ramshackle repairs done to power armor suits that was so common that it become its own variant. You see, as the Heresy went on, casualties would mount, people would lose production capability, the ability to repair things, and the ability to get spare parts. Because some legions, like the Ultramarines for example, were incredibly isolated and were not able to get anything. This especially applies to the Shattered Legions of the Salamanders, Raven Guard, and Iron Hands. So they had to make do. They'd take what they had, throw some molecular bonding studs on it, and send you on your way. Basically, it would be a ramshackle combination of various different prototypes, Marks 2, 3, 4, and just kind of stuck on a chassis. It's honestly a really cool armor mark, and I think it's really, really cool looking, despite how beat up it is. But the main thing I like about it is the fact that the experience people had with using the Mark V would be very important for the overall development of power armor going forward, as those who had to repair and maintain it would find areas of weakness that would teach valuable lessons to power armor designers, and these lessons learned from this suit would go on to influence power armor designs long after it. The Mark VI Corvus pattern was the last armor mark developed during the later parts of the Great Crusade, and in all honesty, is a upgrade on the Mark IV in a lot of places. Things like backup power routing systems would be introduced, enhanced sensors. It was a very quiet suit, making it better for stealth, and was overall more modular and easier to repair. It was a bit less protective than the Mark IV, but it was still an incredibly versatile and adaptable suit. Not all legions liked it though, as the Iron Warriors hated it, the Ultramarines thought it was adaptable, because they're Ultramarines, and the Raven Guard adored it, along with the Alpha Legion. And the Raven Guard would go on to be the faction most well known for using this pattern even as the 42nd Millennium. And by the end of the Heresy, this and the Mark V were the most common suits used by both Traitor and Loyalist forces, and as such, the Traitors and Loyalists even now still have a bunch of Mark VI lying around. There are a couple oddball marks of armor that exist. The Imperial pattern was introduced in between the Mark II and III, and is not common at all. It's used by Lee II, the prototype Space Marine that protects Erida, but that's really about it. It's also just the Rogue Trainer Space Marine suit, and I think that's really cool. There is also the Saturnine pattern Terminator armor that is supposed to be based on the Mark VI. No pictures of it exists, and it's just kind of a thing. And it's really kind of forgettable because everyone else forgot about it too. There is also this prototype Terminator armor used by the Salamanders Legion. It existed in extremely limited numbers, and no examples of it survived the Heresy. So, yeah. But one important thing to mention is that outside of the main power armor marks, each legion typically had locally produced parts and variants that would give each armor mark a different look. Usually a different chest piece, helmet, or shoulder pads that would allow for a more usability, or just a different identity for each legion. Now, not a lot of these suits survived to the 42nd Millennium. There is barely any Mark II still existing, as most of those suits were used by Loyalists since the Traitors already had a bunch of new stuff, and a lot of it got broken, meaning it got replaced by Mark V. And the only suits that I can think of Mark II that still exist are in the hands of the Death Guard, the Iron Warriors, and this one guy from the Carcharodons. The Mark III still exists in the Imperial Fists a little bit, but like I said, it's going to be used by the Death Guard or the Iron Warriors. The Mark IV still exists somewhat, the Iron Hands know how to make it, and I believe the Red Scorpions have some of it as well, and the Mark V can be used by basically anybody. They can still make it, but considering the fact that there are better suits around, it's not really used very much, and the Carcharodons use it pretty frequently, but that's because they're off in the middle of nowhere and don't really have consistent supplies. But Mark IV and V are heavily used by Traitor Legions, as Mark IV is still heavily used by the Black Legion, Thousand Sons use it almost exclusively, and Mark V is used by a lot of warbands who are spread quite thin. The World Eaters have a lot of it, with Karn even now wearing his suit of Mark V. And in regards to Terminator armor, the only real surviving suits of Terminator armor from this period exist in the Traitor Legions. Overall, the armor of the Horus Heresy is truly a thing of its own. It's basically one of a kind, and is part of the reason why I love the Horus Heresy so much. It's this uniquely different part of the Warhammer setting that has an entirely different feel. And while I love 40k, I love the Horus Heresy just as much, if not more. If you want to learn more about the various different power armor marks, read the Horus Heresy Black Books from Forge World and the Age of Darkness main rulebook that serves the current Horus Heresy game. These books, outside of telling a bunch of lore about the Horus Heresy as a whole, do a great job of showing the different armor marks and the various different variants for each legion. It is a great resource in general if you want to know anything about the Horus Heresy. Valdor, Birth of the Imperium, also has some stuff about the Thunder Warriors as well, and Warhammer 40,000 compilation has a pretty good breakdown of all the armor marks pre-Primaris, covering marks 1 through 8. Thank you all very much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please consider becoming a YouTube member, and thank you very much to the YouTube members who are supporting the channel. It really means a lot to me. Thank you all very much for watching. Have a great night.